Let me go ahead and get... All right, so we are picking up in our study once again of the book of 2 Samuel. This morning we are again looking at the story of David and Absalom. Absalom, of course, being one of David's sons, and he is a son that had killed another son of David, as we have seen before. And the last thing that we noticed is that Absalom is going to basically be able to return home. Remember that he fled away from his father to the king of Gershom, and basically he had been living there in part because, what is David going to do as a response to what, Absalom's murder of Amnon? Well, we know that obviously bothered David in chapter 14. Joab contrives this whole plot to try to get this woman to sort of convince David to help let Absalom return back to home, and that's essentially what happens here. Joab, of course, gets his wish, and Absalom is able to return back home. And so, where we pick up in verse 25 is that there is basically about a 2-year gap between Absalom returning home and then 2 years later, Absalom would then go in, present himself to David. So that's kind of a unique situation that, David and Absalom returns home, but David doesn't see him, doesn't see him for 2 years. But notice, beginning in verse 25, "Now in all Israel there was no one who was praised as much as Absalom for his good looks. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head there was no blemish in him. And when he cut the hair of his head at the end of every year, he cut it because it was heavy on him. When he cut it, he weighed the hair of his head at 200 shekels according to the king's standard. To Absalom were born 3 sons and 1 daughter, whose name was Tamar. She was a woman of beautiful appearance." Now, this passage does kind of make us remember the description of Saul back in the book of 1 Samuel, right? Saul was a man who stood above, all the men that were around him, said he had a really good appearance. And notice here that the Bible does focus on Absalom's physical appearance. And there's a little bit of a similarity here because, again, there's this whole concept of sometimes people, when they think about who they want to lead them, they do that based on the person's looks. Now, we know, of course, that when it came to King Saul, whereas the people liked Saul, he looked like a king. He fit the warrior type of model because of his size. Ultimately, he was not a great king for Israel, at least by the end of his life, because, of course, he departed from God. And that, as we saw in 1 Samuel, that's why God emphasized specifically in 1 Samuel chapter 16, that David was a man after God's own heart. Or at least David had the qualities that God was looking for as a king. Even though he's not perfect, he did have the qualities that Saul didn't that would make him a better king. Now, you keep that in mind and you think about here that now, as we talk about Absalom, who is eventually going to try to take the throne from David, there is this passage that's trying to distinguish between the two. People looked at Absalom and thought, this looks like a really good leader because he's got a lot of hair, doesn't have any blemishes on him. He looks basically like the perfect specimen of a man that you could possibly have as a leader. And sometimes people, again, when they think about who they want to lead them, they do that based on looks. This past week, in my U.S. history class, we were talking about the 1960s. And you go from President Eisenhower to President John F. Kennedy, there's a whole lot of a difference in terms of looks. You look at, especially President Eisenhower, he's an older man at that point. But then when I brought up a picture of John F. Kennedy, a lot of the girls were like, yeah, that's a good-looking guy. Because he was probably arguably, he's considered America's most attractive president. Because he's young, he's good-looking. And naturally, there were a lot of girls in my class that thought to themselves they had a very good positive impression of John F. Kennedy before knowing a whole lot about him because they simply looked at him based on his looks. People tend to do that. But that's not always a good, it's not always a good way to judge the standard of a leader based on the way that he looks. Notice that not only is Absalom good looking, but he makes me jealous because he had a full head of hair. It probably makes several men in here jealous, right? When he cut the hair of his head at the end of every year, he cut it because it was heavy on him. I have never had that problem. I will never have that problem again. As most, I guess a lot of men in here won't have that problem. But again, he has a lot of hair. Typically, again, I had a student of mine make the comment they liked JFK's hair. He had a full head of hair compared to Dwight Eisenhower. That's just something that, at least physically in the mind's eye, people are typically more attracted to. A lot of the more popular movie stars, athletes that are considered good looking, especially male athletes and movie stars, have a head full of hair. That's just a way that we typically, what we assume to be attractive. Notice again that it was so heavy on him that he had to cut it. Right? He cut it at the end of every year, and that it weighed 200 shekels according to the king's standard. From what I understand, this could be a little bit sort of well, we might say hyperbole, just to emphasize how much hair he had. But from my understanding, the 200 shekels being a measure of weight would have been about 25 pounds. I don't know hair weighing that much, but it could have just been there to emphasize that he had a whole lot of hair on him. Now, that could have been in contrast maybe to David if he is a little bit, older at this point, showing signs of age. Absalom looks like the younger, good-looking, eventual opponent to David, who many people might see as being old and sort of out of touch, which we'll kind of get that from chapter 15. Notice that to Absalom were born 3 sons and 1 daughter whose name was Tamar. She was a woman of beautiful appearance. Now, of course, the daughter Tamar sort of would have been in reference to Absalom's sister, who we've already read about. Notice that he has 3 sons. The text says that he has 3 sons. Now, I want you to flip over in your Bible for a minute to chapter 18. Most people think that these 3 sons died very early. They didn't die in childbirth, they died very early on. And that is because, and some people might use this as a possible contradiction, but I think when you look at what we just read with 2 Samuel 18 and verse 18, the indication probably is that Absalom's sons died early on. Notice what's said in 2 Samuel 18 and verse 18. Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up a pillar for himself, which is in the king's valley. For he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar after his own name, and to this day it is called Absalom's monument. So, if you read through 2 Samuel, you might get to chapter 15, then you get to chapter 18 and say to yourself, well, hold on, the Bible said that Absalom had 3 sons back in chapter 15. But the indication here is probably that his sons died very early, which would explain why he makes the statements made in 2 Samuel 18 and verse 18. So Absalom returns home. He has 3 sons. He's, again, a man that is, valued based on his looks. Everything seems to be going well, except for the fact that the relationship between him and David has yet to be mended once again, right? Notice verse 25. And Absalom dwelt 2 full years in Jerusalem, but did not see the king's face. Now, obviously, I'm not a parent, but I know most of y'all in here are parents. Can any of you imagine going, and maybe you have, but can you imagine as a parent going 2 full years without ever seeing your kids? and potentially your grandkids, right? Because Absalom has children. We don't know if David saw them or not, but could you imagine as a parent going 2 full years without seeing your own kids and even potentially grandkids?
Especially living so close by.
Yeah, living so close by too, right? I mean, it's not like Absalom's over in another country. It's like they're, we don't know where he's living at this point, but I mean, you wouldn't think, but pretty close to where David's living, and David still doesn't see him for 2 full years. And I'm not a parent, but I think I can speak for parents when I say that most parents would not wait this long to see their kids, no matter what type of bad thing that they have done, because parents love their kids. And sometimes there are circumstances where this does happen, but in this particular situation, David goes 2 full years knowing that Absalom is living in Jerusalem, but still does not see him. And some would point that perhaps this helps motivate or spark some animosity on Absalom's part towards his father, because David doesn't see him right away. And what we gather from that is that the relationship between the two has not been mended at that point, for whatever reason. So Absalom again lives in Jerusalem for 2 years, doesn't even see his dad's face. Verse 29, therefore Absalom sent for Joab to send him to the king, but he would not come to him. And when he sent again the second time, he would not come. And so he said to his servants, see, Joab's field is near mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire. And Absalom's servants set the field on fire. So, from Absalom's perspective, when you think about David calling for you to return home, perhaps in Absalom's mind, he looked at this as like, Dad's finally forgiven me. He's allowing me to come back home. But then all of a sudden, when he returns home, he doesn't, Dad doesn't want to come see me for 2 years. At least from the perspective of a son, that might create some natural resentment. So much so that Absalom is so preoccupied by this that he's got to get Joab's attention to allow him to go to see the king. So what that indicates to us is that Absalom, who at one point had been part of David's administration, part of his court as his son, David was not willing, or at least at this point was not ready for Absalom to come back and be officially welcomed back into the king's court. He didn't want to see his face. And for Absalom, that might very well create some natural resentment. But nevertheless, he will do whatever it takes to find his father, even if that means setting his uncle's field on fire. So he said to his servants, or I believe Joab would be his cousin, I believe. One of the two. So he said to his servants, see, Joab's field is near mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire. And Absalom's servants set the field on fire. If you can't get somebody's attention, go set their property on fire. That's a good way. It's a good way to gain somebody's attention. I was out eating with a couple of friends last night, and one of my friends, where he was living down in Jackson, he and his wife are in medical school, but they were living in their neighborhood. There was somebody who, one of their neighbors, I think, was threatened by another man that he would, that if she didn't cooperate with him, or I don't know all the details, but basically he said he'd come and burn her house down if she didn't cooperate with him. And lo and behold, my friend showed me the video of that house burning down, because it was a way for him to try to get that woman's attention, that he's being serious about whatever the situation was. But to go in to set somebody's property on fire is a very good way of gaining somebody's attention. I believe it was in the 60s or 70s. I cannot remember what it was, but there was a monk, a Buddhist monk, that it may have been Vietnam, but anyway, he was protesting the war, and he actually lit himself on fire, and it killed him. But the whole point was that this display, this very drastic action would sort of gain attention to his movement. And it did, because there were pictures of it when it happened. And that's Absalom's point. I've got to get Joab's attention because I've got to see David once again. So Joab arose, came to Absalom's house, and said to him, "Why have your servants set my field on fire?" Now, if you think about it from Joab's perspective, the answer here should be pretty obvious, right? If you keep ignoring Absalom's request, it's not hard to connect two and two together. My field's set on fire because I hadn't been paying attention to Absalom. So verse 32, Absalom answered Joab, "Look, I sent to you, saying, 'Come here, so that I may send you to the king to say, why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me to be there still. Now therefore let me see the king's face, but if there is iniquity in me, let him execute me.'" Now, there's a lot of importance into what Absalom is saying here. Naturally, Absalom wants to know why David has called him back. If David's whole point to call him back was to comfort his own mind, at least in a sense, and not to receive Absalom back as a son, then Absalom's point simply is, I'm better off to be still in Geshur, right? I wasn't seeing my dad then. I was off in another country. I might be living a couple of minutes away from my dad now, but things really haven't changed because I don't see him anymore. So Absalom recognizes that while David might have sent for him back, David's relationship with Absalom is not where Absalom thinks it needs to be. It's as though things didn't change at all, is what he's saying. Now notice what he says in response to that. "Let me see the king's face, but if there is iniquity in me, let him execute me." Now, the point being, if I'm innocent, shouldn't have a problem seeing the king. If there's iniquity in me, then I should be put to death, which we note is perhaps the reason why Absalom ran in the first place to Geshur. But again, if you think about it from Absalom's perspective, if the whole point was to call me back to administer judgment on me, punishment on me, it's been 2 years, right? Why hasn't it happened yet? If that's what my responsibility is, if there's iniquity in me, then let him execute me. So, it's been 2 years. If I deserve to be punished, go ahead and punish me. Give me what I deserve. But if I'm innocent, declare my innocence. Let me come and see the king's face. Let David accept me back into the king's court, because then I'm innocent. And Absalom's point is, David, make up your mind, make a decision. Am I innocent or am I guilty? So David has to deal with, how do I handle this situation? This is a situation that's in some ways a little bit similar to what we'll talk about in the second sermon this morning. But again, Absalom's saying, David, stop being on the fence, and really telling Joab to tell David, essentially, stop being on the fence, make up your mind. Either accept me back as a full pardon, or give to me the punishment that I deserve. So now, Joab, verse 33, Joab goes to the king and told him, and when he had called for Absalom, he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king, and then the king kissed Absalom. Now, if we didn't have the rest of the Old Testament, it seems like we have sort of at least a happy ending in terms of the relationship between David and Absalom. Absalom goes, he pays proper respect before the king. David then simply kissed Absalom, which of course was a greeting typically given certainly among friends, but also among family members as well. And based on that, it seems like everything is fine. But of course, a lot of times the physical action of concern and compassion doesn't necessarily reflect a person's true intention. Right? Where else in the Bible do we read about a man giving a kiss as a greeting, but having an ulterior motive for it? Judas, right? Judas gave Jesus a kiss, certainly as the greeting form of that. And the whole point of that was not because Judas was necessarily happy to see Jesus, but the whole point that Judas is trying to identify to the soldiers which one Jesus was. And so there was an ulterior motive behind it. Naturally here, the point being is that this relationship is not mended just because there's been a physical exchange where what we would commonly think about that a greeting would be given among family members. There's still a lot of underlying tension that's going on there. You know, perhaps your family might be that way sometimes. Like, you're very friendly to one another when you get together for the holidays or you get together for a family reunion. You know, and you exchange the pleasantries, you greet your family members. But sometimes you can kind of tell when there's a little bit of animosity between family members. They don't necessarily perhaps mesh with one another as they should. And that's perhaps the case with what's going on with David and Absalom, especially from Absalom's perspective, as we see in chapter 15. The one thing that I will point out about this section in 2 Samuel 14, verses 25 through 33, something to keep in mind is that, and I think this is true for leaders, I think this is also true for Christians, we need to be as decisive as we possibly can with settling problems with other people. Now, of course, you know, should David had put his son to death because of him, you know, again, killing Amnon, that's certainly something to think about. But there is another idea here about how do you mend relationships between family members, between friends, between Christians. And there is a point of truth, I think, that does come out from this, an overall point, that whenever you have a problem with somebody, the longer that you let that problem fester and go unnoticed and not give it attention to try to reconcile it, generally that problem is only going to get worse. And that's true for a lot of things in life. The longer that we put off a particular problem, the harder it becomes to try to get that problem solved. And for David, you know, had David, sort of like in the parable of the prodigal son, right? Had Absalom returned back to Jerusalem and David's standing there with open arms ready to receive him back, perhaps Absalom doesn't have the animosity to try to launch a rebellion against his father. You know, we don't know. But you have to think about here, you know, if David had made a decisive decision within when Absalom returned home, whether that was to forgive him or to punish him, perhaps you don't see the events that are going to happen in chapters 15 and following. So that is a point that we have to take in mind as Christians. If we ever have a problem with somebody, the best thing that we can do a lot of times is to try to get that problem solved as quickly as possible. Because we don't want to allow any type of hatred or envy to linger on, because it becomes extremely hard to resolve that the more that situation gets worse over time. With that being said, are there any comments or thoughts that you'd like to add on to what we've talked about through chapter 14?
You know, Adam, chapter 18 in Matthew tells us how to do that, emphasizing the fact that you need to get it corrected, and whatever's wrong between two brothers,
right,
or in this case a father and a son,
yeah,
get it in the open, get it cleared up. Can you imagine though Absalom for those 2 years living there in Jerusalem with his dad close by, and all his friends seeing that he's just being shunned?
Yeah.
Because even Joab didn't have anything to do with him during that period of time, evidently.
Right.
So as you said, that really could have brought on a lot of hard feelings.
Yeah, it's not a good thing for your family to not notice you. That's certainly true. Of course, you bring up the book of Matthew. Jesus made that point in the Sermon on the Mount. Don't think you can go and worship God when you knowingly have a problem with your brother that you're not trying to resolve. Right? That is the whole point. Go leave your gift at the altar. Go resolve the problem with your brother. And like what you're saying in Matthew 18, there's sometimes occasions where we have to bring other people with us to try to help resolve that situation. And that was a really good thought. We have to do whatever we can to get that problem solved, not just for our sakes, but also for our relationship with God as well.
Paul said, "Don't let the sun go down on your wrath."
Right.
Or don't go to bed before you solve the problem. And this 2 years of not dealing with it. So, like you say, the sooner it's dealt with, the better.
Right. All right. So if we ended in chapter 14, everything seems like it's fine, but chapter 15 comes along and we realize that things are not fine. So chapter 15, again, this chapter fits within this context. Again, keep in mind that we remember what Nathan had told David, that the sword would not depart from David's house as a response to his sin by having Uriah killed and committing adultery with Bathsheba. The statement was made, the sword will not depart from your house. In this chapter, we see another reason, or at least another a moment that's setting up for, once again, the sword being administered and the death of another one of David's sons eventually. Here in chapter 15, we see that Absalom has very ulterior motives to David's reign as king. Chapter 15, verse 1. After this it happened that Absalom provided himself with chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. Now, it wasn't uncommon for a king to assign soldiers or part of his bodyguard or whatever the case may be, not just for the protection of himself, but also for the protection of his family. But what we want to notice in this chapter, in verse 1, is that Absalom is the one taking the action here. Absalom provided himself with chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. From what we understand, this is typically the action that a king would take, especially for a king that wanted to be noticed by other people. So a lot of times Emperor Nero, for instance, would have this sort of situation where there would be a lot of chariots and horses that accompanied him as he traveled throughout the Roman Empire. And it was basically a way of announcing to the people that the emperor is coming, right? He's on his way. And so you give proper respect, you prepare for the emperor to come. And this is sort of what Absalom's doing here. He's providing himself with chariots and horses. This was an action that a king would take to prepare for travel and his arrival. Notice that he had 50 men to run before him. From our understanding, 50 men was perhaps a whole military unit within Israel's army. So this is not a couple of bodyguards that David has. These are men that Absalom has selected that are almost his small military unit that go before him to protect him as though he were a king. So, verse 1, we get the sense that Absalom is very ambitious, and probably ambitious because of the animosity he still has towards his father. So naturally that takes the place that Absalom is going to start acting like a king, at least in terms of how he travels and how he is protected. That's verse 1. Notice verse 2. Now Absalom would rise early and stand beside the way to the gate. So it was whenever anyone who had a lawsuit came to the king for a decision, that Absalom would call to him and say, "What city are you from?" And he would say, "Your servant is from such and such a tribe of Israel." Now, there are a couple of things that are important in here. First of all, notice again, the Bible's very specific about the timing here. Absalom would rise early. Now, in the Bible, a lot of times the indication of rising early is not just in the sense of getting up early in the morning, but a lot of times it connects to the idea of the eagerness to do something. And that is certainly being tied in with Absalom here. Not just that he would get up early in the morning, but that he was very eager to go and to stand beside the way to the gate. This is something that he knew, this is something that he liked, and this is something that he planned on doing every single morning, and he's very eager about carrying it out. Notice that he goes to stand beside the way to the gate. Typically in the Old Testament, and this may be true in the New Testament as well, typically judicial matters were held at the gates of the city, on the outskirts of the city. They didn't have a courthouse like we do today, where if you get in trouble, you have to go and stand before a judge and plead your case. A lot of times, judicial matters were held by the gate of the city. And notice what Absalom is doing here, right? So it was whenever anyone who had a lawsuit came to the king for a decision, which this is a responsibility of the king, right? The people wanted a king that would judge over them, to rule in these types of matters. That this is an action of a king. Notice that they're going to David, but then Absalom comes along and calls to him and say, "What city are you from?" And he would say, "Your servant is from such and such a tribe of Israel." And the point being is that these people that are coming to the king to make a decision about a lawsuit, Absalom's basically stepping in the way and saying, "Here, let me handle this lawsuit. Let me resolve this dispute." Some might say Absalom's doing this because he's trying to take the workload off of his dad. No, that's not the case, because we know in the context here, Absalom's trying to sort of prove himself as king, to win over the people, which is eventually what he's going to do. And one of the ways that he does that is not only to start acting like have the military of a king, but he's also trying to take on the responsibility of the king, to rule in these judicial matters that the people had grown accustomed to seeing David and letting him resolve. So that, verse 3, Absalom would say to him, "Look, your case is good and right, but there is no deputy of the king to hear you." Moreover, Absalom would say, "Oh, that I were made judge in the land, and everyone who has any suit or cause would come to me, then I would give him justice." And so it was, whenever anyone came near to bow down to him, that he would put out his hand and take him and kiss him. And let's go ahead and get through verse 6, and we can come back and comment on this next week if we need to. In this manner, Absalom acted toward all Israel who came to the king for judge. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Notice in verse 3, not only does he take up the responsibility of the king, or at least tries to do that, he's also throwing his own father under the bus, in a way. "Look, your cause is good and right, but there is no deputy of the king to hear you." Now, in a way, this is throwing his father under the bus, because Absalom's sort of portraying it here that, the king's not taking the time to set up a deputy to hear your case, and then for the deputy to bring you to the king. You almost get the sense here that Absalom's trying to portray that David doesn't really have the time to deal with your simple dispute. Right? David's the king. He doesn't have time to reconcile these individual lawsuits and disputes between Israelite citizens, because perhaps he's too busy. But then Absalom comes along again, verse 4, and says, if I'm made judge, things are going to get better. Everybody who's right is going to receive what they want. Again, I would give him justice. But if I were made judge. So again, you get the idea here, right? Absalom's trying to take the throne, right? By trying to weaken the respectability of his own father, right? My dad can't handle things as the judge of the land, but if I were judge, we wouldn't have any type of disputes anymore. Justice would always be administered as it should. We'll go ahead and stop here for we'll go ahead and stop here for today, but I will say this. I wonder sometimes in the back of my mind when Absalom is saying this, that he is not reinforced in his own mind by the fact that David failed to administer judgment to Amnon for, again, raping his half-sister, or for Amnon raping his half-sister. I wonder if in Absalom's mind he feels very, very much empowered to say this because he knows for a fact that David failed to bring justice to his own sister when it came to handling Amnon. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and stop here this morning. But again, thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. We'll pick up with comments, and we'll start in this section, Lord willing, next Sunday.